maybe not. But okay, so recording now. A couple things I wanted to talk about before we got started. First was sort of our schedule in this class. I'm going to make a slight variation to it. If you've been kind of keeping up with the schedule, you would see that the bouncing ball, the jumping bottle is due today. We haven't even started rigging the bottle, so how is that possible? It's not. So what we're going to do is we're going to postpone that, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to have it, I think, start or have it due on the 22nd, which is a big difference. There's a reason for that, though. So 10/22 will be our new due date. So just so you'll know that, I will go back to the assignments, bottle and ball, and I will change it in here. Final render will be due October 22nd, 2018. That is on is it a Monday? Yeah, 10/22, Monday, October 22nd. So, the reason I'm doing that, a couple of things. Fall break's coming up. For some of you, this will be your first fall break. It, sucks the energy out of a semester. I know you're all needing a break. I'm needing a break too. I'm looking forward to it. But it's right there in the middle of it, and I usually try to have a project due right before it, because what happens is you'll be steamrolling through, and then we'll hit fall break, and it's like you just get limp and fall on the floor, and it's really hard to get that momentum back at the end of this. So that's really what Wednesday when we come back is for. Wednesday and Friday of next week. So for those of you who haven't been keeping up with the calendar, how fall break works is it's a 4-day weekend. You'll have Saturday and Sunday, as you usually do, off. And then you'll have Monday, Tuesday off of that next week, right? So that means we would come back on Wednesday, 8:15. You'll all still be dusting beach sand out of your hair or whatever it is you have planned for the break. I know probably more than half of you are planning on just kicking back and watching TV or something, right? But we'll come back from that, and that is a short week, so it's also hard to kind of get motivated there. That week, where it's saying we're going to do Maya mug modeling, that's actually where we're going to focus a little bit more on the animation of this bottle. So today the plan, on Wednesday the 10th today, is to get one of our bottles rigged and ready to animate. We may make so much progress that we're able to start animating it. And the animation lecture for that bottle is not going to be super intensive. Basically, you already have animated a bouncing ball. It's not significantly different. There are some notable differences between a bounce and a jump. But a lot of the process is the same, right? And so we may get to that, but if not, that's what we'll cover the Wednesday when we come back from fall break. You'll have that Friday to keep working on the project. It'll be due the following Monday. Okay. So does that make sense? If I get around to it in enough time, I'll go ahead and edit this schedule. So this coming Friday, I will likely be in the building. But as usual, I'm not taking attendance, and so if that means you're wanting to get fall break started a little early, I'm cool with that. I would say plan accordingly. If you think you can use that time to get some work done, this work has to get done sometime, right? Don't be well, I have no other time to do it, but I'm still going to take Friday off, right? But recognize that stuff's just going to start to putter out toward the end of this week, and I understand that. I've been teaching long enough for that. So kind of another piggyback from this conversation. How many of you got a chance to go to the portfolio reviews last night? One person. Thank you, Nose. So, what did you think?
I couldn't stay for the whole thing because I had another project that I needed to get done before today. But I stayed for like the first two. And I really liked it. I didn't like think that there'd be that big of a gap as far as how people presented like their projects. So I liked the differences.
So it was Catherine and Clay. You got to see. Yeah, those were two good ones. Those were a great place to start off. So, so cool, awesome. I know there was a whole bunch of people there from a lot of different classes, but I wasn't really like looking around taking a roll. The other half of portfolio review is tomorrow night, Thursday night, from 5:15 to whenever. Seems like we're going to about 7:30ish, 8 o'clock, something like that would probably be the latest. I wish you all could have been there. There were some really awesome examples, but I understand schedules permitting. I encourage you to please come out and check those out, and it's an extra credit opportunity as well. So, yeah, I think I've already shown you the list. If you have any questions about who's going to be presenting, Thursday night is a little bit more animation, a little bit of game design, and visual effects. The very last person who presented last night was visual effects, and his reel was incredible. Like, it was just amazing. Like, that he's going to be a director somewhere soon. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on from there. I'm trying to think if there's any last minute things I wanted to cover. If so, we'll bounce back to it. So, I did want to mention, you probably got your, I don't know what they're called to you. Like, we call them early semester progress reports. I don't know if they call that to you, or if that's the midterm grades, or how you get your notification about it. But we put those in. I sent you all an email to let you know that does not have all of the grades in there. I didn't get to grade the maze. I had to pop out of town early that week, and so I didn't get to go through to that last pass. So if you had any revisions in the folder, that didn't show up in that. There was and I guess we kind of did cover some of this in class. There was a healthy range of grades in there. We ranged all the way from people who literally have like a 5 to people who have like a 97.3 in this class. Like, it's a spectrum, right? Wherever you fall on that spectrum, I encourage, even if you're the 97.3 or whatever, I encourage you to push it even more. I think that is one of the reasons I like getting people to go to the portfolio review, is because this is not one of those majors where you get a degree and that guarantees you a job, right? Like, you get a degree because you are exceptional at this. Like, you work really hard at it, right? Like, phoning it in is not like, yeah, you'll get a degree, but you'll work at GameStop, right? Like, you're not going to work at Blizzard unless you're really pushing yourself every day at this. And so this is the first opportunity to do that. Push your work. Like, even if you're like, oh, I got a B, that's pretty solid. I'm okay with a B, right? Why? Like, push it up to an A. Like, make it an A. So I encourage you to submit those revisions. Again, I haven't checked the revisions folder in a few days, so for all I know, it's like got 26 submissions. Every person here has already filled that up. If so, that's awesome. If not, and you have nothing else that you're planning on doing on fall break, that's a great thing to do. I know it's like, I'm sure, yes, do homework on your fall break. But that little sacrifice now will make your life a lot easier in the future. So hopefully everybody has some form of bottle to work with today. If you don't, you're welcome to follow along, or you're welcome to if you don't, you're welcome to like follow along on just some proxy objects. Like, you can rig a cylinder or something like that to see how this is going to work. I'm probably going to do my shampoo bottle just because it has a clear front, side, and back, right? That's what I'm going to be. that's what I'm going to be rigging today. And pretty much the method that I use to rig that, I could very easily rig the hot sauce bottle too. They're quite the pair, shampoo and hot sauce. So because I'm going to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and hide my hot sauce bottle. I've actually, I think already got a layer for it here. And so I can just turn that off. And for this guy, I'm going to go ahead and zero him back out in X. Put him back at the 0 there. So you'll notice a couple of changes. This is not actually the one I was modeling in class the other day. This is from a previous class. I just saved it because I always forget to save the file I'm working on in class, and then it gets deleted. So it's a little bit different, probably a little lower res in this part. I added some extra detail up here for the cap. But I think this is a pretty decent starting point, right? First thing we're going to do is we want to kind of, before we get started on this, let's talk a little bit about why we are rigging this, right? Because you all already know how to animate an object, right? We just grab it, we hit S, we move it around, hit S again, right? I've animated my bottle, right? There's a very big difference in something moving and something seeming to be alive, right? And so I need more than just to be able to move and rotate this bottle. And in fact, it gets more complicated if I tried to rotate it, because if I have just both of these selected and I rotate them, I get something like this, right? This is not optimized in a way that an animator can just take this and get a performance out of it. Making something move is easy. Making something move exactly the way you want it to is hard. That's what an animator's job is making something move in a very specific way. And so rigging, the process of rigging, is really just to create tools for an animator to use so they can get a better performance or a better animation out of that object. Okay, it's an interesting position. If some of you start to like rigging, God bless you, because somebody's got to do it. Most animators hate it. Like most animators, like they'll learn to do it. They're like, I just don't like that much. I can do it. The response you'll hear is, I can do it if I have to, right? And but you might be surprised. Like a good portion of people, we have a small percentage, I'd say probably 15% of animators who really kind of dig it. Like they're like, that's a lot of fun. I enjoy that. It's because it's a problem-solving thing, right? We from the very beginning, when you're going to rig an object, you're looking at your outcome. You're looking at who is going to use this and what are they going to need to do with it, right? And that's sort of a design question that a lot of people in design have to do. A website. If you're designing a website and you're saying who's going to use this and how do they, what do they need to do with it? Like you need to be asking that question from the very beginning. Rigging is then solving those problems, right? If I needed to make this bottle grow horns and like have an evil grimace or an evil sneer, like that's the problem the rigging artist has to solve. How can I allow the animator to make that performance happen, right? And so some of it's pretty easy. For this, we just need to, I want to make this bottle feel like it's alive. So that means it needs to be able to bend, maybe squash and stretch, maybe twist around a little bit so it can look around, right? Luckily, you're the animator as well, so you can answer that question. Like you should probably be thinking, what do you want your bottle to do? How do you want your bottle to move, right? And then you start making the rig to allow you to do that. But some animation questions or some rigging questions are very complicated. We have he graduated from here when I was in grad school. Chase Cooper. He actually came back and spoke via a Skype call last semester, but he's one of the TDs at ILM. He worked on both of the new Star Wars movies, and I remember one of his first major projects was the Edward Norton Hulk movie, and he had in his demo reel that what he rigged was the transition from the bad guy in Hulk. He's the Abomination. Yeah. He rigged that transformation, like where that character turns from a human into that creature, right? And so that means he had to make controls to allow the animator to get like the bulges and the skin deformations to happen in there. And that was a concept from the very beginning that had to be developed so an animator could make that animation happen, right? And so it's a problem-solving thing. If you like solving problems, if you like fixing things, if you like coming up with elegant techniques for solutions, that's what a rigging artist does, right? They make somebody else on the team, they make their life easier. So again, right now, your problem that we're going to solve with this isn't as complicated, right? The biggest thing is we need to be able to make this object deform, and we need to be able to animate it in a way that is efficient, right? So I could show you techniques where you could make this object deform just by moving one vertex at a time and setting keyframes, but that's not very efficient, right? I could show you how to throw a deformer on here, and we could just start animating immediately, but you would have to go digging around for controls to find out how to get it to bend. And like what we're going to make is we're going to make, like our ball, right? We're going to make one control on the ground, because that's where the object touches the floor, right? We're going to make one control on the ground that allows the animator to do everything that they need to do on that one control, okay? And that means when you're animating, you just have to grab that one control and hit S and adjust values on that one control. And that's like your master remote control for this thing, right? Is this one control on the floor. So before we get into that, before we get to how we make that control, let's just talk about deformations, right? We've seen how squash and stretch works on the ball. I'm just going to kind of go off to the side. I want to make some new objects here. Actually, let's make a cube. Pull it off to the side so we can focus on it. And I'm going to make it. I'm actually going to make two versions of this. There's that one and this one. So one of them I'm going to add some subdivisions to. The other one I'm not. Oh, sorry. Making sure those weren't super important texts. So we see the difference in this. The first thing we need to remember about deformation is really it's just a real-time way of changing the orientation of all of our vertices, right? And so for our deformation to work correctly, our model has to have enough information in the model for this deformation to work, right? So the first one I'm going to introduce you to is a set of, it's called Nonlinear Deformers. You'll be able to find them in the Deform menu. And this Deform menu is in a lot of different tabs. So it's under Modeling, it's under Rigging, there, and it should be under Animation. I'm not for sure about Effects. Yeah, it's not under Effects. So any of those you'll be able to find Deform, right? And what we're looking for is these nonlinear deformers, okay? I'm actually going to grab this tab, like this little double line across the top, and if you click that, it will break off this window, and I can just kind of keep it there so we can look at them, right? So the nonlinear deformer we're going to use first, just to see how it works, is the squash deformer. We're kind of familiar with that one just from the ball already, right? So if I grab the object I want to deform, and I click this squash deformer, you'll notice something happened. You can't necessarily see what's going on there, but there's like some blue lines in here. If I hit 4, you'll kind of see that there's this object inside of it. You see that? We can also, it's a separate object, and if I open up my channel box here, I'm sorry, my outliner, you can see it's just this squash 2 handle, right there. Now the squash 2 handle doesn't do anything. I can move it around as a separate object. I'm going to leave it where it automatically puts it, and underneath our inputs, you'll see this squash 2 node. So this is where all of that deformation happens. There's envelope, factor, expand. Let's go ahead and just change our factor a little bit. If I click on this number and start cranking it up or down, let's get that. Yes?
Sorry, the nonlinear menu, how did you get it like that?
Oh, I'll show you. Under Deform, Nonlinear, anytime you see this little double line across the top like that, you just click on that double line and it breaks it off. So this is a way you can kind of build a custom interface a little bit. I don't think you can snap that to anything. But. So again, to me, clicking in the value here and dragging, it's taking it up a whole number at a time, which is a bigger squash and stretch than I really want. So I'm going to click on the word factor and then middle click in my viewport to raise that up and down a little bit. And you get an idea of what's happening with that. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. I'm just adjusting factor. That object is staying inside, it's staying at the same location as my box, right? If I grab my box and move it, it really messes it up, right? They need to stay together. Or if I grab my squash handle and move it, it messes it up. Now, sometimes this is the effect you're going for. You're wanting something like this to happen to your object. And so if that's the case, that's cool. Use that. But this is one of the things that students mess up a lot, because whenever you're ready for this to start jumping around, you're going to grab your object and start jumping it, and it's just not going to work, right? That's not what you're going for. These things have to move together, right, for that to stay deformed. So just remember that in the future here, we're going to be looking at that. Now, the reason I made 2 boxes is because you see that this one's got way more vertices in it, right? Way more edges. And that means if we zoom in here, all of these edges are still straight. That illusion of being curved is happening because I have enough vertices in there to get that deformation in the object. This other object, where I just have it, where it's just one vertex tall, if I put a squash deformer on that, factor will still do stuff, but it really just seems to make it taller and shorter, right? I'm not getting that bulge in the center. And that's not the same thing as what we wanted, right? So that was really the only reason that was there. Let's go ahead and delete that. Okay. Yes?
When you were moving it up and down to get it like that, how did you get it so you could do it?
You're getting that big chunk jump?
Yeah, basically.
So there's 2 different things you can select. You can either select this squash 2 handle, and it's this squash 2 input, and I'm just adjusting factor. But if you click out here on the number and drag, it's going to go up a whole number at a time. See how it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, like that? Yeah. If I click on the word factor and middle click in my viewport and drag from side to side, it'll go up a 1/10. And actually, if you need to be even more precise than that, I think if you hold Control and middle click, it'll go up like a 1/100th. Usually middle clicking on factor will work. And of course, you can always type in your number too, right? Now, you can just be selecting the squash handle, but you can also just select the object itself. And you'll see squash 2 under here is part of the inputs, right? So this is a good spot to talk about inputs. What does that even mean, right? We call Maya a node-based animation software. Node is sort of the alternative to layer, right? Photoshop is a layer-based software, right? And if you want, you've all probably used Photoshop. If you have one layer, you want to put a mask on top of that, right? then that, like, there's a linear order in which those changes happen, and they go up this layer. Nodes mean multiple things can be piping in at the same time. I can have 5 things changing it at the same instant, and none of them are happening before or after the other, really. That's not super important, except to let you know that everything you do to Maya creates a new node for it, right? And some of those nodes are important, and some of them are not. In this case, the node that is causing this deformation to happen to our box is the squash 2 node. And for our rig, that's important, right? But there are other nodes that happen, like maybe you were doing this squash just so you could change the shape of this for a model. Well, after that, I don't need that squash node anymore. It's done. That's what I wanted it to look like. And so, but that all stays part of my object's history, right? So we'll notice if I go back over here to my bottle, you'll notice that if I grab the bottle, look at all of these nodes that are in here. Right? I got this poly extrude. I got a whole bunch of poly tweaks. Poly split ring, poly split ring. All of those nodes are just things that I did to this bottle while I was modeling it. And Maya is remembering all of that, right? And you can, although this is not very useful in terms of work, I could always go in here and like make changes to that. And it doesn't make it better in any way, right? But basically I can turn off the influence of that history. Since that's not ever really something I need to do to this, I'm happy with the bottle where it is, and adjusting all of those nodes are not going to help it. That just means it's weighing down the file, and it also weighs down the model. Like when it comes time to rig this, Maya's doing a whole bunch of unnecessary calculations. So one of the things I can do is delete that history. If I select these objects and go to Modify, and then edit, delete by type, history, right? That's going to wipe out all of those input nodes that went into making the object where it is now, right? And so now, if I select this bottle, you'll see the only input node is silk, right? And I think that's just because, I think that might be a texture that I have applied to that, or a material. So that is something we want to do before we rig. Right? We want to delete our history. The other thing you'll realize is that I still have a lot of values on my translates and rotates and scales. Like, Maya is not thinking of this bottle in the shape that it is. It's thinking of it as if it were that shape. It's just, it's thinking of this object as if it's natively that shape. I've just warped it, right? And that's not how I want it to think of it. I want it to think of it as this shape at all times. And so all these numbers have values in it. So to get rid of those values, I'm going to select both of them, and I'm going to say Modify Freeze Transformations. And what that does is it zeroes it all back out. Right? It puts it all back to a fresh object. Freezing your transformations and deleting your history is something you should do before you rig. Okay? It can cause some major issues if you don't. So if you're done modeling your model, do that now. Like delete your history, freeze your transformations. However, you want to be careful about freezing your transformations and deleting your history after you've started rigging. You also should probably do those things before you start any UV work, which we may or may not get to some UVs today. We're definitely going to get to them in the next project. I'd like to touch on them a little bit for this one if you're wanting to material your ball, or I'm sorry, your bottle. But you definitely want to freeze transformations and delete history before you do any rigging. So recognize though, if I go over here and say edit, delete by type, history, watch what happens to my squash 2 handle. Disappeared, right? Maya thinks that like part of the history of this was a deformer, and I've already deformed it, and I told Maya delete the history, and it's like, all right, I'll forget about that deformer we used to deform this, and now that box is stuck like that forever, right? Like, I mean, I can undo, but if you save this file, you can't like stretch it now, right? That's the new shape of that. So that's something I kind of warn you about, because some people will try to delete history on everything all the time, and you can mess up a rig by deleting your history. I also show you this because deformers are actually good modeling tools, right? If what you're trying to model is some form of like strange little like music box or something, like that's an interesting shape for that, right? We can use that to quickly get some deformations. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that and get my deformer back. And let's play around with this a little bit more. The thing you'll notice is if I just delete that deformer, my box will go back. So let's try adding some other deformers to this. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out. Give me a couple more height divisions just so we can see this. Let's put a bend deformer on there. So if I click this bend deformer, again, you're not really seeing anything, but if you hit 4, you can see that it's just a line through the center of this, right? And again, I have an input for bend 1. And it just has a couple of values on here. It has curvature, and then it has low and high bound. Envelope is basically the way you can turn the entire deformer on and off. So it's like you can like blend it on or blend it back off. I usually don't use that for very many things. So curvature, if I click on curvature and middle click here, we'll see, I can get a bend out of this, right? Now, this is pretty easy to use. It just, you have to sort of think about it a little bit, right? Right now, it's curving at the middle, right? And if you look at where my object is, that's where it's positioned, right? That's where the center of my bend deformer is, right? Is at the middle of that object. So if I were to move that down this way, I get a little bit of a different bend, right? And so now my curvature has a different result on it. Right? I want to undo that to here. As well as if I rotate this, I can get it to do this kind of deformation, right? Now this high-low bound is a little bit confusing to people, but really it's kind of simple if you think about it here. If I look at if I hit 4 where I can see this, basically high bound and low bound is saying how far above and below our center point, our pivot point, right, do you want this deformation to affect, right? Like right now it's affecting 1 unit above and 1 unit below our center point, right? So if I turn my low bound to 0, it's not going to affect the lower part at all anymore, right? And that means if I moved this down to the bottom, again, say about right there, right? Then it's affecting this bend is affecting the lower half of my model, and then the upper half is just sort of along for the ride. Now, if I wanted that to continue to curve too, you'll see my high bound only goes halfway up, right? If I want that to continue to curve, I need to extend my high bound up through the top of the model. That. So now my curvature affects the entire model. So I need you to recognize that these things are things I can animate. Right? I can animate my rotation on this object. I can animate the translation of this. I can animate the curvature of this. Right? And so those are a lot of controls that I have on how to make this object deform. Right? We're going to leverage those a little bit here in the future. So let's look at a couple of these others really kind of quickly just to see what these deformers do. We have a flare deformer. And what that's really going to do is it allows us to sort of flare the bottom or flare the top and add a little bit of a curve in the middle of that. All right. Go ahead and delete that deformer. We have two of them that are kind of interesting. We have a sine wave and a sine and a wave. All right, so if I do the wave, I think it kind of puts it in here in the wrong orientation. I can change my amplitude for that wave, and you see that I get this. And if I change my offset on that, you're going to see I get this. All right. Now, if I orient this a little bit differently, something like this, right, then I can get some kind of neat stuff out of this. Right? You could probably use this to fake like a water droplet in a sink or something like that. And then we also have wave, which this does, wave's what I just showed you, wasn't it? Sine is what the other one was. So sine works a little differently, but still similarly. The difference in sine is we basically, hopefully you all are kind of vaguely familiar what a sine curve is. It's a fluctuating up and down curve that kind of goes at the same interval as the radius of a circle. And so we can make that sine wave and change the amplitude and the wavelength. Right? And then we can offset that to get this. So just looking at this, I could animate this right now. I could animate just the offset and effectively have sort of a swimming fish effect, right? And so again, when we're talking about these deformers, we're talking about solving problems, right? What, like somebody gives you a model of a fish, and they're like, we need to animate this swimming to the ocean. What do you do? Like, do you put a sine wave on it? Do we put bend deformers on it and manually animate that wave? Like, it's kind of your call, right? Let's go ahead and delete that. I'll show you the last deformer. Why not? Twist. And twist is going to work a lot like flare and bend. We just get this start angle. We get this end angle. And we can just kind of twist around. Now, the cool thing about this is we can combine deformers, right? I already have that twist on there. If I add the bend on there as well, right, you'll see that now my object has the bend and the twist deformer listed, right? And so I can bend my object and then twist the end angle, and I can get pretty much a whole performance out of this, right? I can use that to kind of be like the head that looks around, and use the bend to be the curvature of it. It's important to remember that the order in which you apply these deformers matter. So, yes?
My bend doesn't bend like that. It kind of just makes it.
Yep. So your object is just one polygon tall, so it can't see how mine has all the different edges. So that's where you created the object. More subdivisions. You may have to do that before you apply the deformer to it. Okay, so I'm throwing a lot of new tools at you. This is probably an appropriate time to talk about how to learn this, right? Have you ever helped like your dad or your grandpa or your uncle or whatever like fix a car? Especially like when you're a kid, like I did a lot. And my dad would like carry out this giant box of tools and set it down and open it up, and he would be like, hand me the 7/16 socket or something. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, he has this giant box of tools and he knows that they're all in there. And he doesn't use them all at once. What he does is he looks at the problem and he says, I need a socket to take that bolt off. And I think it's probably the 7/16. Let's try that. Right. So when he would ask me for that tool, I would be like, is this it? And he'd be like, no, that's a screwdriver. I'd be like, is this it? No, those are wire pliers, right? You have to learn what each of these tools are going to do too, right? I'm sure there was some point when my dad was picking up that screwdriver and being like, is this a socket? And his dad was like, no. Actually, his dad was probably way more rude about it. So you have to learn all of these tools, but you don't have to know how to use them right now, right? I'm introducing you to the toolbox, like one tool at a time. I'm like, look, there's a giant toolbox full of stuff in here, right? And then how digital media classes work is we then introduce you to a problem, and we say, hey, remember all those tools we taught you? Go try and see if you can solve that problem with those, right? And there's like, if I just told you the answer, use the 7/16 socket, twist it, counterclockwise, blah, blah, blah. Like, that doesn't help you, right? Then you just memorize the stuff. What you need to do is learn how to solve the problem with it. So don't worry that like you don't maybe understand what low bound is right now, or you don't quite understand like why this thing has an envelope. That's what trial and error is for, right? The way you learn this is we give you this challenge, and then you start working with it, and you test out that tool, and you're like, oh, that socket doesn't fit. I must need one a little bigger. And so kind of keep that in mind. This is, I especially in a lot of these lectures, I throw a lot of information at you. You don't have to memorize all of that. You just have to know it exists when you go back to try to solve the problem yourself. Okay? So if you're following along, that's great. If you're messing it up, like if something's happening and you're like, that's not working, that's an opportunity to learn, right? Like figuring out why it's not working and how to fix it. Like that's where you're going to learn the most. So I showed you a bunch of tools. Let me show you how I would go about applying this to our character, the bottle. All right. So first things first is I know I need my bottle to bend, right? I want to be able to make it lean forward. I want to be able to make it lean back and sideways, all of those things, right? So I know I'm probably going to put a bend deformer on there. My bottle has to jump, and because we learned the 12 principles, that means it requires anticipation. It requires squash and stretch. This is nothing more than junior asparagus again, right? And so I probably need at least those two, squash and stretch and bend, right? And really the biggest reason I want bend is to kind of give him some direction, right? When it leans forward, I want it to feel like, or when it jumps forward, I want it to lean forward to feel like it's kind of, leaning into that, right? You can add more than that, but I'm going to put at least those two on it. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bend on there first. So I can put one deformer on more than one object at the same time. So I'm just going to select both of these and put the bend on there. And what we'll see is if I bend that curvature now, get some bend out of there, right? Now I want it to bend by default, like forward and back. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate that forward. It looks like negative 90 degrees. And so now that means my curvature by default is happening this way. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and leave that. Never mind. Because I'm going to hook something later to that value to drive it, and it'll just reset it anyway. So my curvature is going to do this, and my rotation is going to give me the option to do this. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't look like my bottle's leaning because the bottom is also wiggling, right? So this is the part that usually, it's like 3 or 4 steps, and it usually confuses people when I walk you through it, right? The first thing I'm going to do is move my pivot point all the way to yes.
Well, so when I'm doing it, I'm applying the bend deformer. It's
Yep.
not wanting to work. Oh wait, okay, never mind.
Got it?
Okay.
All right. All right. So that location of the bend is something we can control, right? And if I want it to feel like it's sort of leaning in from the ground, like it's sort of like leaning forward, then that means I need that bend to happen lower. In fact, I don't really ever want the feet to kind of kick out from under it. Right? So I'm just going to take all of my low bound off of there. And again, what that means is, this is my center point. It's just going to take away all of the deformation below that center point. So if I take that down to 0, right there, now everything underneath the center point is not going to be deforming, right? All my curvature is just going to happen up here. And if I want to animate the location of that, I'm animating my translate y. Right? Now, if I just set that to 0, it's just going to put it all the way down at the bottom. Right? And my high bound is going to change how high up through the bottle that extends. Right? I want to put it probably about 2.1 for mine. And so now my bottle has an entire curvature through it that I can get like that. And if I wanted to rotate it this way to get it to lean forward, I can. Right? And so those are the controls I'm going to use to kind of edit this. Right? I want to be able to slide it up and down. I want to be able to rotate it around. I want to be able to bend it. Right? So all of that is pretty much set to go now. The problem with this is if I wanted to go ahead and start animating it, I have to move 3 objects now, right? If I wanted to make this jump around, I have to grab the bottle, I have to grab the lid, and then if I have a bend on that, and I move that without affecting the deformer, then it just blows up and does some weird stuff, right? So it's like all 3 of those things have to go together. And then if I decide to rotate, it gets even worse, right? So I need something to keep all of this together and clean. And usually what we use for that in rigging, we call a controller, right? A controller is a single object you can animate that manipulates more than one object. Yeah, a good example, like a puppet controller, is going to manipulate the arm without you having to grab the arm and move it exactly where you want it. Yes?
So whenever I'm adjusting my curvature, we'll go past 3.
We'll go past 3. Try clicking on curvature of the word, and then middle click out here, and then leave word into it. You can also type in higher numbers, the letter will do it.
Well, so first, is it right that the low bound really goes up 0?
Yes, yeah, because low bound is like how high up to the center point we're going.
Why is it doing that?
So it's because that's one big part. So I think you need to put some more edge loops in there and on the inside of the bottle. You probably have to unrig it first, delete that deformer first, and then just, I think it's under, you should just go and delete it. And then under the mesh tool like this, so the mesh tools are edit mesh. Insert edge loop. And so you can just insert more span. Yeah, that's what he was getting to. Yeah. So if you want to do the lower part too, just grab the actual bend deformer and just lower it. No, and just move it down. So yeah, I'm getting a few people who like the and then looks like that's selecting on the inside of this. But that's try to selecting like on the outside.
That would be nice.
It's a lot easier.
Now it's going to change a little bit how it smooths it. Your bottle's but the more those edges in it, the more deformation.
That's
Okay. So a couple people are having this issue. I think this is normal. That if you're clicking over here in the curvature on this value and cranking it up, it's only going to 3. I don't know why they think 3 is the most amount of curvature you'll ever need. But if you click the word curvature and middle click out here, it'll go way up higher. There it only goes to 180, but we can go higher than 180. Like we can type 900 into that thing. And then after you've typed that number in, if you middle click and type, well, maybe not. If you've typed in 900, if you middle click on curvature, oh, apparently not. Oh, well. So if you need to go higher than 180, which you probably won't, you just have to type the number in. So. Okay. So again, we have these 3 objects. We need to be able to control all of them, right? All of them kind of together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a controller. And the controller needs to be something that will not show up in render, right? Like I could use any object. I could use a box. I could use an entirely other model, right? But I want this to be something that when I render it, we don't see it, right? And so NURBS curves are one of those things, right? So that's why curves have a tendency to be used as controller objects. So a sphere or a circle works really well. So if I just click a circle, you'll see that it automatically just creates a little tiny circle on the ground. And I can kind of scale that out and make it visible. Now, right now, if I look, it's like right there on the floor. Something some people have an issue with is they try to select the curve and they keep selecting the floor. That's okay. Really, what I would do is I would just put my ground on a different layer and then lock that layer, set it to R, so you can't select the ground plane, and then that's a way you can quickly grab that. But just like any other object, I can also make this curve a little more dynamic. So I can right-click on this and go to Control Vertices, and I can raise up some of these points a little bit just so I can see it hanging out on the ground. Now, I moved all of those vertices, but when I go back to the object, you'll see that the pivot point is still perfectly on the ground, right? And really, the pivot point is the important part. The curve is just the part we're trying to grab. It's probably also kind of hard for you to see that up on my screen, so I'm going to show you something else. This isn't really that important, but if you need to change the color to this curve, you can do that under Attribute Editor. I think it's Object Display and Drawing Overrides, is it? And then if I enable overrides, I can change the color of this object to be whatever I want it to be. All right. And so a lot of people will use this to sort of color organize their rig. Right? Like if you have a character and you want all of the right arm or all of the right limbs to be red and all of the left limbs to be green. That way when you're looking through this like sea of controllers, you're like, that's green, that means it's the left, right? And so that's one of the things you can do. I'm mainly just doing it here so you can see the objects a little bit better, right? So don't sweat that part if that's not something that's more of an aesthetic thing. So what I have now is just a single ring, one to rule them all. The only problem with this is where I had to make it bigger, right? Now I have some scale values in there. And so if I ever need to get this back to its default location, I have to memorize 6.557, right? If I manage to scale this. Just to make this easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and freeze the transformations on this as well. So modify, freeze transformations, and that wipes out all of those values, right? I'm also going to name this. This step is something that people neglect all the time. Like, I'll name it all later. Stuff will stuff will build up over time, and you're going to be modeling a scene, and suddenly you're going to be like, I wonder what polycube 78 is. And if you just start naming stuff early, it's a little bit of time you put into the beginning of it, but it makes the end process easier.
The curve surface, I just
Yep, some of the curves and
why is yours all bent?
right click on it and control vertices, and I just manipulated it a little bit to shape. So we was just showing them how to make the curve. Sometimes you can get creative with these too. This used to be one of my favorite parts of rigging, is that this curve can have all sorts of information on it in terms of values. So right now it has 8 sections, which means there's 8 control vertices. If you need to make this a distinctive shape so you can see it, like you can turn this up to like, let's try 16, all right? And then grab all these control vertices. Let's grab every other one, maybe. And then scale them all in, and then pull them down or whatever. So you can make all sorts of interesting shapes that just like clue you in that this is the controller for the bottle cap, right? Like it's not something that's necessary, but that is something that you can do pretty easily to get like more dynamic selection pieces. Because when you get deeper into rigging, eventually, like a character rig will literally have upwards of 1,000 different controls on it, right? There'll be like 5 to 16 different controls just for the lips, right? And that's not including the jaw, which affects the lips, right? And so it gets really difficult to keep all of that organized, and so that's the only reason I'm showing you this. Right now, it's not a huge deal, but the biggest thing is I do want to name this, okay? And keeping a naming convention that you will remember or it makes sense to you later is important. So I'm going to call this bottle, and then to recognize in my outliner that it's a control, I'm going to do _ CTRL. This is just my naming convention that I stole from Marty Fitzgerald because it's the one he used when he was teaching TD. And so now CTRL just tells me it's a control. GRP tells me it's a group. You can come up with your own. I know a lot of people who use CON for control. So bottle control, right? And this object is now going to be the thing that drives our entire rig, right? In fact, when I start animating, that control we just made, that's the only thing in the entire scene I'm going to set keyframes on. So let's talk about how we can do that. First thing is I want this thing, when I move it around, just like when we had our car, right? I want this to control this piece of mesh, and my deformer, right? So the easiest way to do that, grab all 3 of those. All right, so it's my bend handle, all of that. And then I'm just going to middle click and drag those on top of bottle CTRL. Okay. And so now, as long as the only thing I'm keying is this control, it looks like when I select it, it looks like I've selected the bottle and the lid as well. I haven't. I've just selected the parent of them. You can see that they're not highlighted here, right? And I can animate that and move it around. And if I were to go into this and add some curvature, you're going to see that it still works with it, right? So that brings up the next challenge, right? Is if I need to be animating, I don't want to have to stop. Like I'm moving this control around. I don't want to have to stop, go in here, select the bottle, find the bend 1 controller, find curvature, adjust curvature, and then keyframe that separately. Like that's like 7 steps to just make my bottle bend, right? I want to be able to do it in 1 step. The way to do that is to add additional channels on our bottle control that affect the curvature. Okay. Now this is how many of you have taken a programming class or a scripting class, either here or somewhere else, maybe in high school? This is sort of a simple, like, visual version of scripting, right? We're not going to type anything, but really if you think about coding and scripting, we're just saying, I want this one thing to control another thing, right? I want this one variable to control another variable, right? And variable is just a value that can change, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new channel on my control here in my channel box, and it'll just show up at the bottom. And I want that to control the curvature of my bend. And that means when I set a keyframe on that control, I'll also be setting a keyframe on the curvature, right? So let's look at this. I'll just keep that selected. I'm going to go to Modify, Add Attribute. And then I can call this whatever I want to, and I'm gonna call it Bend. Now you'll see a couple of different options in here. Automatically keyable. There's different data types. Like float means it can be any number. It can be 1.3. It can be -500. Right. Some of these others, like Boolean, like that's a red or green. Right. Yes or no. Right? Vector, string, like these are all like different types of numbers that can fill in there. If you notice on our control, visibility has an on or off, right? I believe that that's a Boolean. I think that's Boolean. It could be enum as well. By default, it's usually set to float. Float is usually what we want and stuff like this. So don't sweat that too much. We can also have a minimum and maximum value in there. A lot of rigging artists use that so animators won't break their rig. Like sometimes you're like, I want to see if I can make this jaw wrap all the way around the back of the head. And you're like, well, you can, but you shouldn't, right? A good example of this is your elbow. Even though I can twist my arm like this, all of that rotation is happening in my shoulder. My elbow only bends in one axis, naturally. If it bends in that other axis, I have to go to the hospital, right? It's a different type of joint. It's a hinge joint right there. I don't know the medical terminology for that. Versus my shoulder, which is a socket joint. It can go all the way around. And my wrist is an even different type of joint. Although my wrist can bend this way and this way, when it twists this way, what's actually happening are two bones in my forearm are crisscrossing, right? And so like there's a lot of interesting reasons to limit certain things. So for your elbow, maybe you only allow the animator to use the rotate Y to bend that, because if you use the rotate X, it's going to bend it in a way that's unnatural, and the viewer will be like, that just doesn't look right. A good animator knows to not do that unless they need to, but sometimes rigging artists just want to protect us from ourselves. So tell them thank you. But that's what these limitations are for here. I'm not going to use any right now just because I don't need to limit this. But let's say somebody was animating with this and they were pushing the squash and stretch way too big. That's a reason to limit that. Like if the art director was like, no, we can never stretch this object beyond this point, then you can put a limitation in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. I could hit Add if I wanted to add more values. But when I hit OK, watch what happens over in my channel box. Now I have this bend value, right? That bend value does absolutely nothing yet, right? It's just a number that has a label, right? I can crank that number all day long. It's not affecting anything. For it to affect something, we have to hook it to something. We have to connect it to something, right? So I may be getting too deep into this, but recognize that when I set a keyframe, right, those channels turn red, right? that means something is controlling that value. That value is not just free to go wherever I want to put it. A keyframe is controlling it, right? So there's a lot of different things that can control values, including other values, other channels, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this bend channel control this curvature channel, okay? I'm just going to hook them directly to each other, so whenever I affect bend, it changes my curvature, okay? Now in Maya, there's probably literally half a dozen different ways to do that. I'm going to do what I think is the simplest. You could do it with a quick piece of script that just automatically connects them together. We could do it with a node editor. I'm going to do it with a direct connection, which just means a one-to-one connection. If bend has 5 in it, curvature will have 5 in it, right? If I need some math to happen in there, if when bend has 5 in it, I want curvature to have 25 in it, then I have to do it a slightly different way, right? So how I do this is I go to Windows. I think it's here. Yeah. Wait. Need to make sure this is where they're keeping it. Yeah, it is. Sorry. Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. They change it in almost every version of Maya. Not this, but they changed something. So it's this Connection Editor under Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. And all this does is it shows us all of the things on this object that have a value. And so you see stuff from my translates here. Right? You can see my translate x as a value. If I wanted my translate x of my object to control something else, I could have that happen. All the way at the bottom is our newest value that I've created, our bend, right? So the stuff that is on this side is going to drive the stuff that is on this side. Right? So if I select bend, if I select another object over here, bend is going to control that. Now, yours may have loaded up with nothing in it. If it did, that's okay. All you have to do is select this object and say reload left. Reload the thing that is going to do the driving, right? Now, the thing that is going to be driven is what? The curvature. Now, what is the curvature on? Yeah, that's a little bit of a confusing one because it's on this bend handle, right? It's on this thing right here. But if I hit reload right, I don't see it anywhere in here. It's not necessarily on the bend handle. It's on this input of the bend handle. And so this is where it gets a little confusing. What you have to do is select the bend handle and then select bend one input. Just click on the word. Right? And then if you hit reload right, it pops up a different set of stuff there. What we're looking for is right there, curvature. Yes?
Sorry. How do you do the freezing thing again?
Just modify freeze transformation. Okay. So all this is loaded in there now. All I want is bend to control curvature. So I click on bend, I click on curvature, and I'm done. Like that's all you have to do. You just have to highlight the two and hit close. Now if I hit something else over here, bend would also control it. Like bend could control multiple values over here. So I really just want to do that one. If I close that, recognize now, I can adjust my bend, my bend value right here. And now my curvature value adjusts too. So,
I missed that.
that's all right. We're going to do it again here in just a second. So we're actually going to do this like 7 times here because there's a whole bunch of other stuff I want to add in there too. So for example, if I get my curvature bent, right, I also want the ability to move this up and down, and I want the ability to rotate this without actually having to go in there and hide or select that bend handle, right? So I'm just going to put those 2 values on that controller as well, right? So we'll go through the whole process again. This time we'll just use one of those other values. So I select the controller, I'm going to go modify, add attribute. And I'm going to call one of them bend rotate. I'm just going to hit add. You'll see bend rotate pops up over there. I'm going to do the other one, bend height. Hit add, or I'll just go ahead and hit OK, and it will add it in there. Okay, so again, what I really want to be able to control is that translate Y and that rotate Y on my bottle handle here. So I'm gonna try it this time without grabbing anything. I'm just gonna go to Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. So nothing's loaded. The thing I want to do the driving is the control. So I'll hit reload left. You'll see they're down there at the bottom, bend rotate, bend height. The thing I want to drive, this time it is the bend handle. Now when we did the curvature, we selected bend 1 and hit reload right. If we're just doing the up and down, you'll see that that's here. That's just the bend handle. So if I hit reload right now, you'll see that my translates and rotates are right there. So to double check, I want to do my rotate Y, and I do want to do my translate Y. Yes.
When you did the bend and reload right, what did you select?
Bend and then curvature. And then we're going to reopen it up to connect the other two. Okay. So my bend rotate needs to drive, as you see there, my rotate Y is what causes it to twist around. So my bend rotate needs to control my rotate Y. And my bend height needs to control my translate Y. So now I can hit close. And now everything on my bend control that I use is controlled by those 3 values that are on my controller. I can literally just hide my bend handle now because I never need to touch it again. Right? Everything I need to deform on there is now in those 3 values. And the cool thing about that is I can control all that with one keyframe by hitting S one time, right? I want to add some bend. I want to rotate it around to the front, and I want to push it up just a little bit so it just feels like the head is bending forward, right? I did all of that. If I hit S, it keys all of those channels, right? I want to have it lean back, bend back this direction. I want to rotate my entire object. All of that stuff is being controlled in one controller, and I can control this now as if it's a character, right? So I know all of that was a little overwhelming. The cool thing about this, again, if I want to get my character back to default, 0, 0, and he's all ready to go again. Right? Keep calling it E. I don't know why. I guess it's because I'm okay. How many of you were able to kind of loosely follow along on that? Okay. I missed a few. That's cool. That's why we're going to go ahead and do the whole thing again, except this time we're going to use a squash and stretch, right? Because really, I also want to be able to control my object squash and stretch. And once I have that, I'm done. Like that's all I really want to be able to animate. So I'm going to kind of go through that process again to add the squash and stretch on here, and then I'll save the video, and hopefully walking through the video, you'll be able to kind of catch up. If you didn't get it that time through, that's why I record these videos, right? And I would encourage you to check out those videos. I have a feeling I often get emails or questions that that just immediately tell me you haven't even looked at the video. Try that first, because you will remember it way better by watching that video and figuring it out yourself than if I just whisper the answer, right? I'm not going to whisper it. I would say it out loud. That would be weird if I whisper it. It's the pin deformer. So let's go ahead and add a squash and stretch to this thing as well. Again, we're adding this to the mesh. Right? So I'm going to go to my nonlinear deformers here, and I'm going to add squash. And we're just going to mess around with this a little bit and see what it does, right? So first thing is, if I adjust factor, I get my squash and stretch, but my character is going through the floor. Right? I can also see how that affects my existing deformer already, right? Which is kind of neat, right? And now he's still doing a bend on top of my squash and stretch, right? But that's kind of weird, right? So I may not want that to happen. We'll play around with that here in a minute to see, right? So let's go ahead and zero my bend back out just so I can see what we're getting. The biggest issue with my squash and stretch right now is that its feet are coming off the ground, right? Or going through the ground. So when I stretch it out, they go through the floor. When I squash it up, they come up here. And that's not really what I want, right? If you remember from the 12 principles, the whole reason for squash and stretch is to show us our object interacting with other forces and objects, right? I squash because gravity is pulling me down and I'm building up energy. And so I'm squashing toward the ground, right? I stretch because I'm pushing back off of the ground, right? And right now it's not even touching the ground. Like it's pulling up and off the ground. And that's because the squash and stretch is happening toward the center of the object. So this is another issue with that high bound, low bound thing, right? Again, to understand this, if I look at my object's center point, its pivot point where this arrow is, right? Everything below that is the low bound deformation, right? So if I take that low bound down to 0, wait, that's wrong. There we go. I take that low bound down to 0. Now my factor is just deforming everything above my object's center point. And I really want this to happen from the ground, not just from that point there. I mean, there may be a reason to want that to happen, but right now I want to have it all the way from the ground. So that's another channel you could put in there, is if you wanted to adjust the up and down. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move the actual object's location down to the ground. And I know, just because of the way this makes it and the way I've made my object, for me that's just 0. So now factor is affecting it from the ground up, but it's only really affecting the bottom half of it, right? Which means I need to extend the high bound higher up to the top of the object. So usually that's just a little over 2, so 2.1 should work, right? And so now my squash and stretch, when I adjust this one factor, is giving me something that looks a little more realistic to a squash and stretch, or realistic. This is how shampoo bottles really jump. So that's how we need to set those controls right up to do that. Now we're still going to have a similar problem that we had earlier, which is if I move my object, it's moving it away from my squash and it really messes it up, right? So I need that squash handle to go with us everywhere we go. So I just middle click, drag that on top of the bottle control. And now everywhere I go, my squash will go with us. The last thing I want to do is I want to add a control in here that allows me to control the squash and stretch, again, just from my, or a channel that allows me to control the squash and stretch from my bottle control, right? And that way I don't have to worry about digging through this anymore. So again, the way we do that, Windows, General Editors, which one? Connection Editor, right? I already had that control selected, so you'll see at the bottom, there's nothing there because I skipped a step. Let's try that one more time. So we need to add that channel first. So we need to go to Modify, Add Attribute. And we're going to call this Squash Stretch. I mean, you can call it whatever you want to. That's what I like to call it. And I'm going to hit OK. So now I have that squash and stretch. This is where I go to the connection editor. Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. So squash and stretch is there. The thing I need to add is on this squash handle, but it's the input squash 2 right there. Yours may say squash 1. I think mine says squash 2 because I made another squash deformer earlier. So squash 2, and it's that factor there, but since I have squash 2 highlighted, I can hit reload right, and you'll see there, factor. So I'm just going to hook squash and stretch to factor. Now I zeroed it out, but that's because the new attribute I made was already set to 0. Right? So when I hit close, now you'll see that everything I need to deform is right there. I can bend it, I can rotate it. Let's see what we can get. Let's do some tests on this. So that's looking weird. We'll come back to that in a second. But the other thing you need to realize is that this is something I can, all I really need to animate this entire thing now is that control, right? Everything else I want to not have to worry about. I don't want to accidentally select it. I don't, any of that stuff. So again, I'm going to grab this squash handle. You can turn off the visibility here just by typing 0 or off, or Control H does the same thing, right? The other thing I want to be careful with is sometimes I try to grab that control and I drag select like that, and it looks like I grabbed the control, but what you'll see is I grabbed the control plus the bottle. Right? I want to prevent myself from accidentally selecting that bottle. So how can I do that? Yeah, somebody said put it in a layer. Was that what you were going to say as well, Maddie? Yeah, so we're going to put it in a layer and then lock it, right? So I don't know if I actually have this in a layer yet. It looks like I do. Yeah, I do. But I'll just show you again. Select these objects, add a new layer. We'll call this Silk Bottle Layer. Hit save. Right? And so now I can turn it on and off all I want. But if I just go over here and click this empty square twice till it says R in it, now I don't accidentally select that. The cool thing of that is I also do that with the ground. So if I drag select, the only thing it's even possible for me to select in this scene right now is the bottle control. Right? And that has every value I want on it right there. Right. Now let's talk about this deformation. Let's use my bottle as an example and just kind of try to visualize this, right? If I were to, let's say I were super strong and could bend this, if I were to squash this bottle, right, it would be kind of like a scrunched down version of this, right? And then I tried to bend that scrunched down version of it, I would get a very specific shape. That shape would be different if I bent this bottle and then squashed it, right? So the order in which we added those controllers means we'll get a slightly different deformation, right? We added it in the order of bending it first and then squashing it. And so it's going to deform it in that order, right? But sometimes that's not the result we want. Like sometimes we look at that and go, it's like the lid's all stretchy weird. I don't like that, right? That's just not a good shape for this. There's a way we can change that. Remember when we were talking about nodes earlier? That's called our input order. It's like, it's kind of like your layer order in Photoshop, but more than one thing can be plugged in at any given point. So the way we change this is I select my mesh. I have to unlock it first because I just locked it. I select my mesh and I right click, and you'll see here's my inputs, right? And you'll see squash happens, or bend happens at the bottom, squash happens after that. I really just want bend above it, and I wish I could just click there and drag it above it, but I can't. So what I'm going to do is right click in here, and I go down to inputs, and then all inputs. And you see we have nonlinear squash, nonlinear bend. If I middle click on nonlinear bend and drag that above nonlinear squash, I may have to do it the other way. I may have to drag nonlinear squash below nonlinear bend. You'll see now I get a different deformation. And so I have to do that on both of these. So I'm going to try those two and see if that is a better result with this now. So now I can bend my object and squash and stretch my object. I don't know, it's not bad. I think I like this better than the other result, and it's mainly because I'm not getting all this stretching on the lid, right? Again, it may not be exactly what you're looking for. You kind of have to mess around with it. And I want you to recognize that this is how we solved this problem for this model, right? So I'm going to go ahead and lock this back, zero that out. I'm ready to start animating now. Having said that, I don't think we have enough time for me to animate. If you get to this point, save a version of this file, and then try to animate it. See what you think, right? But I do need to point out, like, this is not the way you rig everything, right? There's so many different, like, you saw our Deformer menu, right? If you click on Deformer, like, we've been looking at these 6. Like, there's our options for how to deform things, right? Some of them are very specific, like I'm just affecting a certain set of vertices, and I can move them however. Some of them allow us to morph shapes into other shapes. And then some of them are just these cages you can put around them to warp them in certain ways. On top of that, that's not all of the deformers. If we go into rigging, to the rigging menu, you'll see this skeleton and skin. That's just a whole separate set of deformers we haven't even started with yet, right? So I need you to recognize that when you rig an entire character, it's not that you put like a bend deformer on each arm or like, 10 bend deformers on the fingers, right? It's not quite that complicated. Skeleton is a way of building, or like these joints are a way of building an artificial skeleton for a character, and then those will deform it in a very specific way, just very similarly to how our actual joints deform our bodies. Skin is kind of a simple version of a muscle system, but it's super simple in terms of muscles, so you don't always get the bulges where you would get real muscles. So, how many of you like this so far? How many of you enjoyed what we've done today? How many of you hate it? Anybody hating it? Don't hate it just yet. Give it a fair chance. Because I know that may have been a little painful, like at times. Like it was much more technical than some of the other stuff we've gone through, right? Recognize that I hate washing dishes. Like I absolutely hate it. It's like one of my least favorite things to do in the whole entire universe. But I love eating, right? And so I recognize that at some point, if I want to eat delicious food, I have to wash the dishes. And that's how I feel about rigging. If I want to be able to make this thing, if I want to be able to animate this thing, and animating gives me almost as much joy as eating, I have to rig it, right? And it's one of those things. There are several points of tedium in all of these different things. If you like modeling, you still have to UV unwrap it, and a lot of you are going to not enjoy the UV unwrapping part, right? Some people shaking their head back there. Every one of them has that. You kind of have to muscle through it and recognize that it does get easier, right? Like this to you in a year is not going to seem complicated at all, right? But the next step will seem even more complicated. And then you get past that, right? There are all these barriers that you kind of have to get past that. So don't let this overwhelm you. I just recorded the whole thing, boring parts and all. And so you can skip through that in YouTube and get your own version of this. Again, Friday, I will be in the building. I have a feeling a good portion of the rest of the students will not. But if you have questions, I'll hop up here. I'll check with you. If you ever, I recognize some Fridays I have meetings. Some Fridays I run into stuff. I always try to be here during normal work hours, like 8-ish to 5-ish, right? So if you ever come in this room and you're like, Marlo's not here, he must be home asleep. He's not home asleep. He's downstairs. Like, come down and find me. If I know sometimes I usually will check in at the beginning of class, and there'll just be a few people here on Friday. If you come in late and I'm not here, just hop downstairs in my office and grab me, or ask me questions. Any questions now? Big questions, small questions? Okay. Yes.
Mine just form a personal question now. Connected on the
Gotcha. Yeah. Let me. I'll hop over there in a second. So, last reminder: tomorrow night, about 5:15, is the portfolio review. That's also an extra credit opportunity. If you go take a selfie, I'll create a folder up there for portfolio extra credit. Or if you are averse to selfies, feel free to just write up a short paragraph and say, this is what I saw, this is what I thought. And otherwise, have a great rest of the day. So, let me go ahead and save this video, and then I'll hop around for any questions.